Well, episode 3, weekend extra edition. We're talking about hunger tonight, and food, and edible provision and the securement thereof. So it's going to be, there's going to be some uncomfortable parts. So that's fun. Before we get into that, I would like to say that the support I've received has been really, really amazing. I really love doing this. Really love podcasting, or whatever this is. It has yet to produce a podcast, but you know what? I kind of don't care. At some point, I would like to do that, but who knows? Who knows what'll happen? I have a lot more viewers than I have subscribers, and I guess I would like to take this time to say to you, don't be shy. Go ahead and click the subscribe button. My little picture that should be this way to what you're seeing. The watermark, which I had finally decided to put on. Also a subscribe button, and that's super cool. Anyways, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel if you're not already. If you are already, of course, you have my thanks. And you already know how I feel about that. I am trying to grow this channel. I don't ever think it'll get to the point of monetization, honestly, which requires quite a lot. But I want to grow it. I want to interact with different people from different places and different audiences. So if you have the time, hit subscribe. And then if you decide not to watch it later, it's all good. And without further ado, let's get right into episode 3. Hunger. Starting off early. Growing up, before the cold, food was a bit of an issue in the household. I realize that now as an adult. As a kid, I was unaware of that. And my parents did a really good job of not communicating the worry about provision to me. Now, I'll kind of jump to the middle of the story and then go back. Maybe not the middle of the story, but I became aware that we were poor in a way that I had never been before when I was about 7. This was during a period of time when we were living with other people. We moved to a couple of different houses, lived with people. We were essentially homeless. Another thing I realized as an adult thinking back, I thought, well, shit, we basically didn't have a house. Not basically, we didn't have a house. We were staying with other people. My mom gave me food stamps, which at that time would have been about 87. Were just paper bills. And she told me to run to the store to get something. I don't even remember what it was. So I jumped on my bike and I rode. It was a few blocks to the store. It wasn't very far. I rode down there and got the stuff from the store. Very different times. And I got the few items that she asked for. And I paid for them with the food stamps. and turn the paper bills over to the cashier. And I remember looking around at me, and people were looking at me weird. Of course, it probably, even back then, it was probably weird for a 7-year-old to be shopping in a grocery store. But I became acutely aware of the fact that I wasn't writing a check or handing out money. I was handing out food stamps to these people. And that stark difference between me and where I was and them really stood out to me. And from that point on, I guess I became, God damn it. Nothing like a little bit of air-conditioned noise. Anyway, I became aware of the difference between me and them. I became aware of the fact that I was wearing dirty, used clothes, and my haircut was shit and all that. And that's when I first started feeling, the first time I remember feeling shame in my appearance and in my station in life. Jump back to a little bit before that. My father was always a very hard worker. I think that his main problem in life wasn't that he didn't have work ethic. It wasn't that he wasn't motivated. It wasn't that he wasn't willing to put in extremely hard labor. It's that he made poor choices in vocation. I don't remember when he first started scrapping, what we called it, turning in scrap metal to a recycling company for money. But I wasn't terribly old. I want to say 5 or 6 when he first started doing it. And at that point, you could actually make a little bit of money doing that. Metal prices were pretty good. Okay, that's flattering. So this is the episode where I have weird shit on my shirt. We would go to, farmers would dump trash in their ditches, and they did it for generations because a lot of farms were handed from father to son and from father to son. So there was a lot of old metal back in these ditches where they would dump their trash. Pretty sure it was illegal for most, if not all, of my life to do that, but nobody's going to go back 80 acres just to check creeks for trash. So my dad would get permission from farmers and go through this junk ditch of old washers and what have you, pull the copper and aluminum and so forth out, and then we'd resell that. We also picked up pop cans on the side of the road. I remember doing that when I was really little. And then we'd go to the local grocery store, the Hy-Vee store there, turn in the pop cans for 5 cents a piece, which 5 cents a piece I think was a little more significant than it is now. But we would turn in trash bags full of pop cans picked up from all over the place. And I'm not sure where I was going with that, but anyways, my parents did provide. We were on food stamps. I remember standing in WIC lines at the community center in town when I was very young and getting all that. Ate a lot of ramen. Didn't realize it, once again, until I was an adult and actually thought about it, that ramen is, and always has been, food you get on a real lean budget. It's weird how your mind accepts things as normal, or just a thing, and then you go back and think about it, and you gain an insight on it. I think I've done that quite a lot about those years. Anyways, both of my parents were overweight for for my childhood, at least, before the community days. And so it seems like there was always something maybe a little off about food and eating and all of that. I'm not here to hang out their dirty laundry, but it is what it is. So then from that, we moved to community, to the cult, without much provision. I think a few people loaned, and by loan I mean gave my parents money. We stocked up on bulk supplies like beans and oats and what have you before we moved out, as I mentioned earlier, but that didn't really last long. There was this expectation that we would move out onto this property, grow whatever vegetables we needed, and hunt maybe. We did grow vegetables. There was a lot, and other and grains and so forth, but there was a considerable struggle with that. Had a lot of failed crops. And as for hunting, fishing went all right in farm ponds and local rivers, but hunting didn't really take off until my younger brother and his friends decided to learn how to do it, and they actually did a pretty decent job. Far, far better than anyone else had, which was maybe one or two deer in the space of 15 or more years. And my brother and his friends would get several every year. But that wasn't until I was nearly out of community, so. Anyways, we grew up very lean. I went into my adolescent years lean, and as I talked about, ate a lot of wild berries. We did a lot of gathering. My father taught me how to do that. Detour time. My mother taught me the value of my mind. My mother, in very subtle ways, taught me the value of my imagination. She always promoted me as a creative person. She never attempted to assassinate that. There were times when she wasn't maybe as strong as she could have been, but I think part of that's personality, and part of that is the pressure of that kind of living with people that are very close. The houses were very close, probably within any house, most houses, I would say, where I lived most of my life, in one of the villages, as we called them, was, we were within, I don't know, probably 60, 70 feet of the next house, and the house after that was about that close, and they were scattered around, but you could walk for 1 minute and run into 4 or 5 houses. So everyone was very close, and everyone was in everyone's business. And there was both a sense of support in that and a sense of invasion in that, I think. And one of the ways that that invasion affected me was my uncle and various other members of the priesthood constantly trying to instruct my mother on how to teach me, when I think that if left to her instincts, she would have done a far more adequate job than they were suggesting. Simply because most of the instruction that came to me as a result of their advice was to push me in a direction that wasn't natural to me. Anyways, my father, back to my dad, when he gathered stuff and just how he interacted with the environment around him was very, very aware of other things having a right to live. And I think that he's always been that way. Taking in, I mean, I still think he takes in stray cats, at least he did. But he wouldn't just unnecessarily kill insects that were out and about. If he was walking by a bug, he wouldn't stop and crush it with his foot. He didn't derive any satisfaction out of asserting any dominance that way. And in that way, he taught me, I think, a unique brand of manhood, both in his work ethic and in how he interacted with his environment. So, anyway, that was his contribution to me. And as for his parenting, he taught me a lot of stuff, and it was good stuff like that. It was all very casual, but I honestly think that he didn't have any confidence in himself as being a father. I know that his father, my grandfather, obviously, in case you guys didn't know that, the father of my father is called a grandfather. There you go. Bit of knowledge. My father had a bad relationship with his father. I don't know that he would quantify it as that necessarily, although he might. But he certainly had no confidence in his own ability to do much of anything, let alone raise another human being. And I think that was crippling, and I think that the environment inside community was such that anything that he wanted to do as a father, all his instincts towards fatherhood were timid enough that they were pushed aside. That, and he was so busy working and trying to keep up with the workload that it was easier just to step into that role as a worker than it was as a father. And there my alarm went off and it scared the living bejesus out of me. Alright, time to switch tapes. Or whatever this is called. So, where was I? One of the things, and I think this ties into the whole food and provision thing. I need to stop drinking that water. God dang it, I'm slugging it like an alcoholic. Oh, that's comfortable as fuck. This huge pressure to work all the time and to always be busy and to always be producing something and to always take initiative kind of dominated community life. And part of that was out of necessity, and I think part of that was out of just this, gosh, I don't even know how to communicate that to somebody that hasn't experienced it. It's almost like a overperformance. Like the only way you can please God and get good with God, maybe not the only way, but the way that you get good with God is by demonstrating a non-stop work ethic. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with labor, but at the same time, there's other facets of life, and the pursuit of holiness and righteousness swallowed up all of that. And one of the tenets of that was a very just a very intense work ethic. It was a very Protestant work ethic. Anyway, sometimes I get lost and I start kind of repeating myself, or I say a lot. And that drives me crazy. So, at any rate, just said it again. I think that my parents did the best that they could. Their natures were maybe not well suited to be parents, especially in that environment. But I think left to their own devices, I think they would have figured it out. But who the hell knows? Who the hell knows? Anyway, back to food. So wild berries, I think I mentioned. Did I talk about it? Well, if I talked about it before, I've talked about it again. Second time around, you're not going to die. Because money was all pooled collectively, provisions were purchased collectively, and some amount of food was purchased every month. It was not a huge quantity, especially for a large and swiftly growing young man like me, and I mean my other friends who were also adolescents at the time suffered as well. I'm not saying that I was the only one. I know that they were hungry. A portion of food was doled out, a certain amount per person. We'll simplify that. No, we won't. We'll go right into the details. It was called an adult family unit, and it was supposedly the amount of food that a person who was considered average would eat during the allotment period, which was about a month, of any given thing. So the average person was expected to use a teaspoon of salt a day or something like that, times 30, which would be whatever, a cup of salt a person for a month, or whatever. So, you had that portion which everyone received. So every single adult was considered one adult family unit. So you could have a woman who, and then this is a literal thing, a woman who was 70 years old, who did the best she could, received the same portion of food as a 20-year-old young man who spent 12 to 16 plus hours a day involved in hard manual labor. It does not take a nutritionist or even a very smart person to understand that the caloric demand of those two people are very different. Unless that 70-year-old person is also Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's not even 70. I don't think, is he 70? He might be 70. I don't know. Anyway, so that was the finished product. That whole concept of doling out a portion to a person that would last them for a month went through different iterations, but it didn't vary greatly in volume or quantity, and it was always kind of the same concept. It just became a little more refined. The amount of food didn't really go up. The idea being that if you went a little bit hungry now and had some set aside, that when Babylon, which is the world we live in here, fell, you would have a cache of food that was readily available, and you wouldn't be in dire straits. You wouldn't be starving. There was a prediction, a prophecy that was made by my uncle that people would be by cornfields eating dirt because they were so befuddled by starvation. Now, I can attest that hunger does change your mind, does alter who you are to some degree, and you become something of a different person. You become more selfish, and you become driven in strange ways. That's my theft of food from my own home and other people's houses. My mom recently commented that I couldn't steal food from my own house, but me taking food from my house was literally taking food from my younger brothers and sisters, and that we were hungry enough that we would trade doing chores for the chance to lick someone else's plate. I specifically remember telling my sister that I would do dishes if she let me lick her plate. That's very hungry. That's very hungry. One of the things, there were a reasonable number of dogs in the community. People love dogs. They had pets. They were good companions, which, I'm not condemning the ownership of dogs at all, but one of the things that was purchased was dry kibble for the dogs. And I think I talked about this earlier, but I ate a shitload of dog food during that time. It helped curb the hunger. I don't know what else. I mean, it certainly wasn't for human consumption, but by God, I consumed it. We also got this sorghum that we would mix into grain for milk cows, and it's like, I don't even know 100% what it's made out of. It has sorghum in it, but it's almost like been sprayed onto sawdust or some kind of cellulite or something. Anyways, it would clump up, and we would eat that dry sorghum, which, looking back on it, wasn't very good, but it sure seemed like a treat at the time, and it staved off the hunger. Dealt with that a lot. The lack of cleanliness, dealt with having intestinal worms for all of my adolescence until I figured out how to wash my fucking hands, which I'm sure didn't help, but just that constant hunger, that constant drive, taking food from other people, trading chores for a couple more licks, and dog food, man, that was an experience. I look back on it now and I understand that there's a certain amount of strength that I was able to reap from that, but it was no good. Putting a child through that is fucking insane, and I'm not sure what the thought process of community, of the adults, the adult collective consensus was on that. I'm not sure. Back to the adult family unit, the measurement of food. Children under a certain age were like 0.75 adult family, 0.75 of an adult family unit, and then at a certain age they were 0.5, and then I think after that they weren't even considered. But that amount of food, which it wasn't significant and certainly not sufficient, was given to the family. The family was expected to take a quarter of their food and put it back in reservation for hard times. It really didn't happen in my house. My mother did her best to actually cook a meal that was as close as she could reasonably get to feeding her family. So very frequently towards the end of the month, we were low on everything. And I think I said something about eating cornmeal mush, which literally is boiled cornmeal. We would put salt and milk on that. Goat's milk at first, cow's milk later. All raw milk. So I know there's been a bit of hubbub in recent years past about raw milk and if people should have it or people should not. Did it for 2 decades. I'm not saying it's ideal, but I am saying it's not lethal. So anyway, we grew a lot of vegetables, attempted to grow ridiculous amounts of vegetables. And there was reasonable amounts of failure. I think that our husbandry of the soil was lacking, honestly. And we would typically, because there was this mindset that you need to go above and beyond to show God that you're willing to do a whole bunch more than is required of you. We would plant way more than we could care for, and then rather than getting a good crop off of a reasonably small plot, we would get almost no crop off of an enormous plot, which is counterintuitive. It's ineffective, and you would think that that would be something that that could be learned from, but rather than taking that mistake of being overzealous for what it was and learning a lesson and moving on to maybe a more realistic endeavor, we just went crazy and hoped for the best, and it didn't turn out all that often for the best. Agriculturally speaking, idiocy aside, the ground, I believe, for gardens and fields was originally broken mostly, at first, especially, with tractors. We paid somebody to come in and break the sod, and then did the best with hose and mattocks and pickaxes and shovels and what have you to till it into something that could grow. That's a bummer. It's not very fun at all. We later got horses, which made things much, much more efficient, much better. We didn't seize the possible momentum from that, maybe quite like we should have, but it was much easier to work ground into something that was usable. But from the point that we got horses, tractors were used somewhat. We had an old Farm All H, which I don't know how familiar any of my audience is with tractor sizes. That's a tractor with the two big back wheels and the two little bitty wheels right together up front, which we would plow with. We later had a very small bulldozer that we would pull plows with. All that was communal ownership, and my uncle was a primary operator of those machines, which he did a pretty good job at operating the machines, honestly. Plus, he was older, so I mean, he couldn't do the manual labor as intensely as the younger guys, so that made sense. But I would say 90% of all that, at least, was done with horses, which is hard labor because most of that equipment doesn't have anything like a suspension system. It's just iron wheels on a iron frame that leads to an iron seat, and that will take a toll on a body for sure. So spent a lot of time plowing and disking and driving a wagon. We did loose hay, which loose hay is like baled hay, except you don't bale it. You just have a machine called a lift that picks the hay up and drops it in the back of a wagon, and you gotta stack the hay. You have a pitchfork and you arrange the hay in such a way that its own weight holds it on the wagon. It's pretty clever. We got some real tall wagons full of hay. That was fun. Then you put it in a barn. It's got this hook setup that comes down and grabs a great big pile of it, goes up and runs in a trolley, and trip a lever and you get a big old haystack. When I was 19 or 20, I actually stayed in a barn that had loose hay in it. I was tired of living with my mom, and they were building a bunkhouse for single guys, me and a couple other fellas. Stayed in that barn, below zero weather. I just burrow in the hay with my blankets, and I did fine. Stayed relatively warm. Getting dressed was a bitch, but I didn't dally, that's for sure. Got right to the Lord's labor. Wake up in the morning and there was frost, because I have like a little hole for air and what have you, and there was frost all around that hole where I breathed throughout the night. So that was a deal. That was a thing. So provision was very labor intense. All things heated with wood, and all wood was acquired manually. Shocker. No chainsaws. We, for the most part, I mean, we would hire guys to chainsaw timber for the sawmill. We had a little gas-powered sawmill later on. But we would use 2-man saws, and that is a saw blade that's 5 to 7 foot long. I think it was the longest one we had. You sharpen the teeth, you got 2 handles, and you just go back and forth until a chunk of wood falls off, and you take an axe and split it. And it probably cut hundreds of cords of wood at least, if not thousands. So, son of a bitch, I'm through 18 minutes again. Well, I've gone on longer than I thought I was going to go on, but we'll get around to wrapping it up here in a minute. Cutting wood is a motherfucker. It's hard work. Falling trees and then hooking a chain on, dragging them with horses, getting them up on a buck, cutting it, splitting it, stacking it. So any food that had to be cooked year round had to cut wood for. Heat, cut wood for it. We did maple syrup. Some of them. Maple syrup is a trip, man. That's fun. It's harder than shit, but it's fun. There's a few things I miss. I do enjoy working with horses. I was kind of a para at the school. I enjoyed teaching the kids, and I enjoyed maple syrup. About 6 miles from where we lived, there was this piece of river bottom on the Grand River in there in Iowa, and there was all these maple trees on the bottom, which is pretty common on the rivers to have a stand of maple trees, from small to great big. And we would go there, set up these massive trays that held, shit, I don't even remember what they held. They were big, probably 5 feet by, 8 feet by 8 inches deep, whatever that would equate to in gallons, a fuckload. And you set it up on bricks, and you go out to the tree, drill a hole in it, a little ways, have a folded wedge of metal you'd tap into the bark, and plastic milk jug you'd catch your, or a tin can or whatever. You'd catch your sap in, pour it in that tray, and boil the water off, and you got syrup. But it was hard work. You got to cut all the wood for that, and drag it in with horses or carry it in on your back, and go out and with little stainless steel buckets, water buckets, and gather the sap, hundreds of gallons of sap every year, and boil it down into syrup. But that was good. Syrup was good. But, back to my dad. My dad loves pancakes, and I'm the same way. I love pancakes. I'll take them over waffles, and mostly I think it's the nostalgia that I get from him, because he would just pour batter into a frying pan until the frying pan was full for one pancake on a 8-inch cast iron skillet, and he would flip it, and he made a big deal out of it, making pancakes. But that syrup went good on pancakes, but it's a fuckload of work. Anywho, so gathering wild edibles, gleaning cornfields behind combines, to dog food and stealing, to syrup, and a nearly failed enterprise at agriculture. It was enough to eat, but by God, it wasn't very efficient. Managed to live. I suppose that's the important thing. And here we are today. And now I'm fat and worthless. Anyway, so that was that experience. As for next time coming up, I think I want to talk about the roles of men and women, sex, sexuality, what was expected of genders, and the whole view of marriage and all that, because that was a very central part of life out there, was family life, even though it was the most meddled with aspect that I can think of. A lot of grief for a lot of people came out of that, including myself, both as a child and as a married man. So we'll get into that next time. As for now, I feel like I'm about ready to wrap it up. If you've made it this far, you're a champion. And I appreciate your viewership. I always appreciate your viewership. If you enjoy this and see the potential in it, please feel free to share it with your friends. If someone's curious about it, or you've told someone, hey, I know this crazy guy who used to live in a cult, show them this. I'd love it. Your feedback remains absolutely vital to me. Please, with questions and comments, it helps me clarify things. It's hard for me to think of what you don't know because I'm so close to it. So please hit me with them questions. As always, like and subscribe, share it, do all that good stuff if you feel like it, or if you just want to keep this to yourself and enjoy me talking to you in my monotone ass voice, then by all means do that. At the end of the day, whatever makes you happy. What makes me happy is sitting here and just talking about this shit. I love doing this. So I appreciate your patronage, and I hope that you have a wonderful week. And until next time, that's going to do it for episode 3. Appreciate you.